Okay, so this week we're going to do a bunch of things, but right now in this particular video we're going to model a simple Greek temple. We're going to review a couple things that we have covered previously, like grouping. We're going to talk about pivot points. We're going to talk about some snapping, and then we're also going to talk about duplicating and some of the special functions that go along with the duplicate tool in Maya. So let's get started. First thing is I have a brand new scene. I'm going to turn off this display in the corner just because I don't need it. It's the heads-up display poly count. Turn that off. I'm also going to set my project. In my case, it's going to be in my documents folder, and I've got a class prep folder here. So I'll hit set. And then I'm also going to save my scene. And I'm going to save my scene as Greek Temple Prep. This is an old empty scene because I had to quit, so I do want to replace it. Okay, so I've got my project set, I've got my scene saved. Now to start work on a Greek temple. And it's very helpful, and I saw some of you do this with the in-class glasses challenge. Before we actually start pushing vertices around, we need to find some reference. So if you go to the Google and search for Greek temple, you will find, as you might expect, a lot of photos of Greek temples. Now, as I said, we're going to do a simple Greek temple. So it's going to be probably pretty close to this. There'll be a couple of rows of columns. They'll also surround an inside kind of chamber room with a very simple doorway. And then we'll do some sort of kind of simple roof to go along with it. Okay, so I'm going to keep an image up on my other monitor just to refer to. I encourage you to do the same. You have large enough screens where you can, hide one there. But so that's the direction we're going to go. So let's actually get started. The first thing that I'm going to do is the base of the temple. Okay, you can see that they all tend to have some stairs. Some stairs go all the way around. Some don't. I think I'll do some stairs that go all the way around. Oh, here can also be a very useful reference, and you can actually see the placement of columns in rooms. So we're doing one that's pretty somewhere between these three is kind of what I'm going for. Okay, so I'm going to add a cube, be my starting shape. I'm going to name it temple_base. All right, and then I need to kind of figure out what dimensions I want this to be. And I think I will we'll go like, 12 wide. We can go 0.5 high, and we'll go like 20 deep. That looks like a good temple shape. All right, now I also want to just move this up so it's on the grid floor. You don't have to do this. It's just kind of it's a thing that bothers me if I don't do it. So the height of my cube is 0.5, and it's halfway in the floor. So if I go to my translate Y and just type in 0.25, now it's on the floor. Okay, again, little thing, not that big a deal, just something I like to do. All right, so I've got my base selected. Next thing that I want to do is add the stairs. So the way I'm going to do this is I could insert, if I go to edge mode and go shift right click, select an edge, shift right click, and I could say insert edge loop tool, and I can do multiple edge loops, and I can add a couple edge loops right here. Okay, I could also, in the inputs, if I just undo that real quick. Okay. In the inputs, I could also just set the subdivision height to 3. The exact same thing happens. Okay, there is no difference. So if I know that I'm going to add those edge loops anyway, There's no reason not to just put it in the input right off the top. Okay? So I've got that. Now, I'm going to select... I want to select the bottom 2 outside faces. Okay? Just those. So the easiest way for me to do that... Oh, we have a rogue cube here. I don't know how that got there, so I'm going to just hit delete. The easiest way for me to select these bottom 2 outside faces, I'm going to go to face select mode. And then I'm going to go to my front view. And I'm going to click and drag across just those 2. Okay, I'm not going to go below it, because if I click and drag below it, that's also going to select the bottom face. And I don't want to extrude the bottom face. I only want to extrude the side faces. Okay, so if you do accidentally select the bottom face, hold down Shift, click on the bottom face, and it will deselect it. Okay. I'm going to orbit around my base and make sure that I have the faces selected that I want selected, and the faces that I don't want selected are not selected. Once I'm sure of that, I'm going to hit Shift, right click, and extrude face. And then I'm just going to do a thickness, and we'll do a thickness of 1. It seems reasonable. Okay. I've got the first step. Now I'm going to do the same thing with the bottom row of faces. And this time I'm going to select it in a slightly different way. When you just want to select one face loop, if you select one face, hold down Shift, and double click on the face next to it, that will select the whole face loop. Okay, I can show you that again if I'll just add a cylinder here real quick. And in the cylinder, you don't have to add the cylinder. This is just for an example. But I'll do a bunch of subdivisions. We'll say like 10 subdivisions. Okay, so if I just want to select one row of faces, I can select one face, hold down Shift, double click on the face, whoops. Okay, I guess it works with, there we go. Select one face, hold down Shift, double click on the face next to it, and it will select the entire row of faces. I don't know why it didn't the first time, but that's the behavior that should happen. Incidentally, if you only want to select part of a row of faces, select one face, hold down Shift, and double click on the last face, and it will select all of the faces in between. This also works with edges. Okay. Although with edges, you can just double click on an edge to select the whole edge loop. And then if you just want a selection of edges, you select one edge, hold down Shift, double click, and you'll select just that row of edges. Okay. That's it for that aside. I'm sure I will have more asides later on. But back to our task at hand, I've got the base. I'm going to go into face select mode. You see that Maya actually remembered what I had selected. So with the appropriate faces selected and nothing else, I will hold down Shift, right click, extrude the face, and again I will set my thickness to 1 and hit return. And there we go. That is my platform. Temple base. Okay. At this point, I'm also going to give this its own layer. So in my channel box layer editor at the bottom here, I've got a layers menu. With my base selected, I'm going to choose create layer from selected. It creates a layer. I'm going to double click on that layer and rename it. And I'll just name it base and click save. And so the only command that I'm really worried about right now is this first one. The V stands for visibility. You uncheck it and it hides it. Turn it back on and you can see it. And then we also have, I can't remember what the P is for. And then the last option is template or reference. So template will set it to a kind of a wireframe mode, and then reference will make it so that you can't select it, which is useful if you've got something that's kind of there and you need visible, but you keep accidentally selecting it. You can just set that layer to reference, and then you can't select it. And then you can click again, turn it off, and now it's back to normal. Okay, so that's the base. That is all Fine and dandy. The next thing that I'm going to do is the columns. And for the columns, I don't need the base visible, so I'm just going to turn that off. Okay. So again, before I start modeling the columns, I'm going to look for a little bit of reference in Google. Okay, we've got a bunch of different columns, varying degrees of fanciness. I'm not going to do this. We're going to keep it earlier Greek in the... I can't read that language. But simpler nonetheless. You know, closer to this than anything else. But we've got basically... There's a square base, and then there's a round base, and then there's the main body of the column, and then there's a kind of a round cap, and then for the simpler ones, it's a thicker round cap, or sometimes even a square cap. So I'm going to compose this column in like 3 parts or so. All right. So the first is going to be the column base. And for the column base, just going to start with a simple cube. I'm going to name it first, and I will name this column underscore base. And then I'm going to set the height to like 0.2. You can see as I try to orbit my view, the base isn't centered, so I'm just going to hit F on the keyboard to center that up. Get rid of that. There we go. And I'm not really going to worry about anything else here. I think that's probably good. No, actually, I will do one more thing. If I hit 3 on the number pad, you can see it flattens out into this mushy disk. I don't want that. So I'm going to add a couple of edge loops here. So I'm going to go into edge mode, shift right click, and select an edge, shift right click, insert edge loop tool. I'll bring up my options. And I'm going to add 2 at a time. So I'm going to use my equal modifier, and I will add them. And then I don't want them quite so far or quite so close together. I want them closer to the edges. Okay, and I'm actually going to hit 3 on the number pad so that you can see the kind of reason for this in action. So I've got those selected, and I'm going to scale them away from each other. And that's going to allow me to sharpen the corners or the edges. Now, if you go too far, you get this weird distortion, and it starts to hollow out. I don't want that. Here's another reason why you don't want to model in the smooth preview view, 3 on the number pad. Because if I go back to 1, you can see that now I have faces overlapping, and that's a bad thing. You don't want that. So I'm just going to go to roughly there. Okay, and that works. I'm going to do the same thing in this direction. I'm going to add my 2 edge loops evenly spaced. Then I'm going to hit R to bring up my scale tool. And I will scale them away from each other. Okay. And the same thing in the third direction. In the vertical direction, I'm going to add 2, hit R, scale them away from each other. And that looks pretty good. Okay, so now if I hit 3 on the number pad, go to object mode. Okay, now it looks like we've got a solid object, and we've got some edges that are catching some nice highlights. Okay. So that's my column base all taken care of. Next is going to be the kind of the column post. I'm sure it has a proper archaeological name. I don't know it. This Google image might help now. No, okay. Regardless, we know what's coming next. So for this, I'm going to create a cylinder. And I'm going to set the height of this cylinder to... think about this for a second. I think we'll set this height to 8. Seems like a good number. All right. Now I need to I need to move this up so it's sitting on top of my column base, right? They need to be, that's how columns work. They're all connected and sitting on top of each other. And to do this precisely, now I could just type it in because I know that my column base is 0.2 thick, and I know that the column is 4, so the column is 8, so if I translated 4.2, or actually I went too far, didn't I? Ah, thank you, I didn't raise the base up. That base should actually go up 0.1. Okay, now everything is setting. There's another way I can do this, though. And this is going to be involve snapping, which is a very useful tool, and it might take a few kind of run-throughs to get used to how it works. But let's start now. So I've got my column, and I can move it up kind of close, and I can go over into front view. All right, and I can move it, and I can get real close, and I can zoom in here and adjust, and again get it real close. But there's always a but. There is an easier way, and that involves snapping. So what I want to do is I want to snap the base of the column post to the top of the base. It's a lot of bases. The way that I'm going to do this is first I need to bring my pivot point to the base of the column. So to do that, first I'm going to turn on vertex snapping, which is the little magnet icon with the dot. Okay, you can hover over it. It says snap to points. That's what I want. So I click that. It's highlighted blue. You'll notice actually the widget here, the transform widget, the center will go from a square to a circle when snapping is on. All right, so I'm going to hold down the D key, which if you remember is how you move the pivot point. Okay, the D key. And then I'm just going to click and drag on this vertical handle, and I'm going to hover over one of the points on the base. Okay, I clicked on the vertical arrow, the y-axis, because I didn't want to move it, to the side of the column. I wanted to keep it in the center of the column. I only wanted to move it in the y direction. Okay, so once I have that, and I can confirm that if I go here in the front view and get really close, you can see that that is centered right on the base of the column. Okay, I'm going to turn snapping off just for a second. Okay. So now that I have that, let me hit 1 here. Now I need to snap the column to the base. And this is going to work the same way that I just did with the pivot point. The only difference is this time I don't have to hold down the D key. I can just, with snapping on, select my vertical handle, and then I just hover over whatever point I want to snap it to. It can be tough to see here because I haven't changed the radius of the column. So I'll do that now real quick. I'll just set the radius to 0.4. Oh, that's the height. That's not what I want. Height we want 8. The radius, there it is, 0.4. Okay. Oops. Okay. So now, if we hover over, and you can see when it's sitting right on the surface, you'll see that actually that baseline will kind of get dashed because it's kind of overlapping. So that's where I want that to be. Looks good. Okay. The last thing, and this is actually something that I should have done first, so I'm going to quickly move that up, is I want to delete these center faces. I don't need them. They're just going to be hidden faces, and they're extra, and they'll just make things more complicated. So I'm just going to go around and select all of these faces. Actually, before I get it, I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I do that, I need to address the number of divisions around the radius of this column. Okay, by default, it's at 20. And I've been saying a lot that, 8 or 12 will get you by most of the time. This is going to be one of those times where it's not going to be enough. We're actually going to do 32 subdivisions. And the reason why will become apparent in a little bit. Okay, 32 subdivisions. the subdivisions along the height is fine at 1, and the caps are fine as well. All right. Now I can delete the caps. So I'm going to do this in the top view, right here. And I'm going to right click to go into face mode. And I'm just going to click and drag a box across the face, making sure that I'm not selecting any of the sides. Okay, so if you keep that box within the perimeter of the column, you will only select the end faces, and I'll just hit delete. Okay, don't need them. They're useless. All right. Now I can go back, turn on snapping, and snap the column to the base there. Okay, that is a tall column. That's probably taller than it really needs to be. So I can fix that real quick by going to vertex select mode, click and drag across the top, select all of those vertices, and I will turn off point snapping. I'll just bring it down. If I wanted to be exact, I could turn on grid snapping and just snap it down 2 grid units. You don't have to be exact. Okay, so I've got the column basically established. Now what I want to do is cap it off. And I'm going to cap it off with something that the identical shape as my base. So instead of adding a new cube and going through all of that again, not that it was a lot of work, but instead of doing that, I can just duplicate this. Okay, so I'm going to select the base. And if I go to edit, I can hit duplicate. Okay, you can see that the channel box now says column base 1. And if I hit W and move it, you can see that there's now another column base. Now I need to rename this because this is no longer the base. This is now the column. We'll call it the cap. You could also call it the top. And then I want to do the same snapping procedure here that I did with the column so that this sits exactly on top of the column. So I'm going to turn on point snapping, hold down the D key, and move my widget, or my pivot point, to the base of the cube. Then I will release the D key and move the cube, the cap, to the top of the column. All right, now we have a column. Cool. Now, for the interest of time, I'm not going to do any additional kind of detailing on the column. You certainly could add a couple of edge loops and kind of scale them out and get some nice rounded tops and bottoms to the column. As you see in, I had a picture. I don't have it there anymore. Okay, as you see in, like here, you could very easily do that. I will, however, add the kind of the scalloping to the edge of the column. And this is why I had 32 subdivisions. So here's how this is going to work. I'm going to go to edge select mode. I'm going to select 2 edges next to each other. And hit Q to just have my selection tool. I'm going to select 2 edges next to each other. Then I'm going to skip 2 edges and select the next 2. All right, holding down shift this whole time. Okay. So the goal here is to select every other pair of edges. And this can be, it can be kind of tricky to not get lost in how all the edges blend together. Okay, so I'm just holding down shift, selecting, and then I will hold down option, click and drag to orbit my view, and then select the next ones. All selected. I'm going to jump into top view. And I hit 4 on the number pad. I'm going to bring up my scale tool. And I'm just going to select the green box. I only want to scale it along the X and the Z. I don't want to scale the height. Okay. I'm just going to scale it in just like that. Actually, you know what? For the sake of ease, I'm going to scale it out. It doesn't really matter. You know, it makes it a little thicker if I scale it out versus scale it in. but it will achieve the same effect. So I'll scale it out. So now we've got bumpy, but if we smooth it, it just looks kind of waffly. I don't know, well, it's probably not the right word, but it's not defined. So with those edges still selected, I'm going to introduce you to one more new tool, and that is the Crease tool. The Crease tool is a way to get sharp edges without having to add extra geometry, whether that be through beveling or adding edge loops. So to use the Crease tool, shift right click, just like you would for insert edge loop. But the Crease tool is just up above it. And you can see select components to crease, then drag middle mouse button to crease them. So I've got my Crease tool selected. I have my edges still selected. So I'm going to middle mouse button, click and drag to the right to add the crease. And now if I deselect, you can see what that's done. So we've got a sharper edge to this. And actually, as I look at this, I'm gonna undo back a little bit, just because I want to scale this in. It's a entirely personal preference, but I'm actually going to scale these in instead of out, and then I'm going to select the outside edges to crease. Again, this is just an aesthetic choice. It's not for any, real mechanical or functional reason. It's just because it bothers me if I don't. Okay, Crease tool, middle click and drag, sharpen those outside creases. Now we can go to object mode, and you can see it looks like I added a bunch of edge loops to get those creases, but it's really just the Crease tool. The Crease tool is best for details you're not going to see close up. It can approximate things and get pretty good, but as you start zooming the camera closer in, it doesn't quite hold up as well as edge loops or beveling does. So it's a good tool to keep in mind, and I do use it not often but regularly, but not an all the time thing. So we have a very simple but complete column created. The next thing that I want to do is I'm going to you can either group these or combine them into one object. I'm going to combine them, so just going to keep my outliner a little bit simpler. Actually, no, I lied. I am going to group them. Sorry. So I'm going to select everything, or the three parts of the column, and then you can either go to Edit Group, or just the key command is Command G. When you do that, you can see it says Group 1 now. Everything is selected in green. I'm going to name the group column and hit Return. All right. So at this point, we have a base and we have a column. We need to move the column up. Okay, so here's kind of a tricky thing about when you start dealing with groups. When you start dealing with groups, you need to pay really close attention to what you have selected. Because if I deselect this column and then I click back on it, I only have this center selected. My name went away, so I never actually named it. So I'm going to name this column Post. Okay. So if I try to click back on it and select the group, I can't. There's a couple ways that you can get back to selecting it. One way is your outliner. And actually, instead of that, I'm going to just go to my Windows and Outliner. This will open up the outliner in a separate window. Okay, and you can see right here I've got the column group, and I click on the plus and I can see the different components of that group. So I'm going to have the outliner open on my other monitor, but that's one way that you can select the whole group. There's a couple other ways. One, up here in this top bar to the left of the snapping tools, which I can turn off, is we have these three icons, which are your selection types. So the default is in the center, and that's select by object type. So if I click and select, it's just going to select the object. If I click to the right, it goes into component select mode. And if I click to the left, that is group mode. Okay, it's going to select groups and combinations. So that's another way you can select the whole group. The last way, and the way that I use most often, is I'm going to bring the outliner back on so you can see this reflected in the outliner. If I select a part of a group, if I select a component of a group, and then hit the up arrow, it will move up in the hierarchy and select the whole group. Okay, and if I hit the down arrow, it will select, lower in the hierarchy. Again, I'll select one part of the group, hit the up arrow, and it will select the whole group. That's the fastest way for me to select the entire group, because I like key commands. Okay? So that's how you select the whole group. Be careful with your selections and make sure that when you want to select the whole group, you do have everything selected. And again, this is where naming is really helpful, so you know exactly what it is that you have. All right, so groups, like objects, also have pivot points. By default, when you group objects together, that pivot point will go to the origin of the scene, the center of the scene. Okay, so X, Y, Z, 0, which, as it turns out, is exactly where I want it. Actually, no, it isn't. I lied. I want this pivot point to be at the base of the column, and right now it's slightly above it. So, same thing that we did before. Turn on point snapping, hold down the D key, move it just down. Oh, can be kind of, there we go. So make sure that we are on, and it can be helpful to see this from the front or the side view. You can kind of zoom in here and make sure that you are on the bottom. And then I want to snap this. I'm going to turn my base back on. I want to snap this now to the top of my base. So I'm going to go with the up arrow and pull it up, and it'll snap right there where it needs to be. Okay, and I can turn off snapping. So we've got one column, which is nice. And we've got our base. The next thing that I want to do is start duplicating these columns. And so I'm going to, with that column group selected, I'm going to give it its own layer. Create layer from selected. I'm going to name the layer columns. Okay, click save. I'm going to turn both of these layers off because I want to talk about duplicating for a moment and the power of duplicating. So I'm going to add a sphere. And I want to make a couple copies of this sphere. So up to this point, we've really only dealt with the base duplicate. I think I may have dipped into duplicate special once. I can't remember. But really up to this point, we've only dealt with duplicate, which we hit Command D. It duplicates the object in its place. And from there, I can move it and do whatever I want with it. Okay, I can scale it. I can rotate it. Really, anything. Anything is possible in 3D. Okay. But there are other things that I can do. The next that I want to cover is actually this third option, which is duplicate with transform. The shortcut is Shift D, which I find is the easiest way to handle this. So let's say that you just want a row of spheres, evenly spaced, but you don't really care exactly what that space is. I can select the sphere. I can Command D, I will duplicate it, and I will move it over. And then I'm going to hit Shift D, and it's going to duplicate it and apply the same transform. Okay, so I can go crazy. I'm just going to keep on. I can even hold it. Well, I can't hold it down. Okay, and that applies to both moving and rotating and scaling. So I will undo all of that back to 1. And this time I will move it and scale it and rotate it. Maybe I'll move it a little bit more. Okay, now I'll hit Shift D. Oops, and we need to... maybe you can't do that many things. Let's try this again. Duplicate. Move. Rotate. Scale. Shift D. There we go. So you kind of have to do it immediately, but it's now applying the same move, rotation, and scale, which if you do it enough kind of starts to look like a spiral and get real weird. So now we can go all the way back down. I don't use duplicate with transform a ton. I think stairs are probably the one time that I use them most often, but I like to be so exact that the third and final option, duplicate special, is what I tend to use. So with duplicate special, the key command is Command Shift D. I don't use the key command for this tool very often because there's so many options with it. I want to make sure that I've got the right thing set. So I'm going to click on the options box, and it brings up my duplicate special options. I've got the first option is geometry type, so copy or an instance. This is very cool. A copy just makes it a duplicate just like we did before. An instance is a linked copy. And if you have an instance of an object, if you modify one object, you modify all of the objects. Okay, so I'm going to reset the settings, make sure I'm at a starting point. I'm going to click instance. I will duplicate special. I will move this over. Now watch. I'm going to select the first sphere. I'm going to select a face. Now as I hover over the faces, you can see it's hovering over the same face on the other object. Now I can select this face, and I can shift right click and extrude it, and it will extrude it on the other sphere as well. Okay, what that means is I can make one object and get it the way I want, and then I want 3 more of those objects. I can make 3 more, and then I decide, oh wait, I actually want it to be a little bit wider. I want to, add something there. It will be reflected in all of the other instances of that object. So that's instance versus copy. If I just copied it, the second extrusion wouldn't happen. Okay. So I'm going to undo back to just one sphere. And then let's go back to those duplicate special options and look at what else we have. We have group under. So this is where it's going to, where in the hierarchy is it going to put your new objects. You can set it to the parent, so if they're already in a group, you can tell it to stay in that group. Under the world, so just kind of root level, or in a new group. And then if you select new group, it'll just create a group 1 with the new objects, and you can rename the group from there. Smart Transform, I'm actually not sure what Smart Transform does. I think it might be like the duplicate with transform option, but I don't ever use that. What I do, however, use is these next 4 options. Okay, this is where you can set exactly how you want the duplicates to be positioned. And you can modify translate, rotate, and scale, and the number of copies. Keep in mind the number of copies is the number of new objects. It does not include your original. So again, really simple. I can just say translate 2. That's 2 units. Let's actually do 3, just so there's some separation there. And number of copies, let's say 3 copies. And I will click apply. Okay. Now, it looks like it went in the negative direction, but that's just because my viewport is spun around because things got crazy earlier. So I will go back to my normal view. Now I can see X is to the right. So each copy, or in this case instance, it moved it 3 units to the right, and it did that a total of 3 times for a grand total of 4 spheres. Okay? I can do the same thing with scale. I can do both. So I can say translate it 3 units and then scale it in the Y direction, I'll say 1.2. And then I click apply, and now you can see that they are progressively getting stretched. All right. I can also, I'm going to close that. I'm going to delete all of these. And I will do let's do a pyramid, because nobody ever uses a pyramid. I'm going to just move it up so it's, oops, 0.5. So it's on the, it's a, okay. I'm just going to quickly get it on the grid floor, because it's going to bother me if I don't. Oops. Okay. Turn that off, snap that down to the grid. Oops. Okay. Now it's on the grid floor. So, I've got my pyramid. I'm going to go back to my duplicate special. I'm going to reset the settings. Again, good habit to get into with this tool especially, because it's really easy to forget that you already had like one thing, like a rotation set, and not see it. But in this instance, actually, I do want to rotate. So I'm going to rotate around the y-axis, and we'll say, I don't know, 15 degrees. So for each copy, it's going to rotate at 15 degrees. It'll also move in the X direction, we'll say 2 units, and I will click apply. Okay. So there's something kind of interesting going on here, is that it didn't just only move in the X direction, because it's not using the world X direction. It's using the object X direction. All right. And I haven't really talked about this yet, but objects have their own kind of orientations. So if I bring up my move tool, I'm going to double click to show my options. The first option is axis orientation. It's set to world, and that is going to reflect the grid coordinates. All right. It's the same thing down here in the bottom left. But I can change that to a bunch of different options. If I set it to object, now you can see it starts to make sense the direction that these are moving. Okay, that's going to point to the next one, because it's going to duplicate the object, move it in the original's X direction, and then it's going to take that new one and move it in that new X direction. All right, not in the world direction. Okay, so be careful there. Other thing I want to show you with the rotation that I think is really cool. I'm just going to undo a bunch of this. Oops. Okay. Is if we move that pivot point. So I'm going to turn on grid snapping. I'm going to move this out to about here. And then I'm going to hold down the D key and move my pivot point back to the origin. So let's say I wanted to make like a clock face. There are 12 hours on a clock face, generally. So I want a total of 12 pyramids, we'll say. That means I want 11 copies, because I already got one there. I don't want to translate these. And then it's the rotation that I need to figure out. So a little bit of math is required. I'm sorry. Some math is unavoidable. But if I have 12, let me open up the calculator, just so you can follow along. And because I don't feel like doing this in my head. If you have 12 points around a circle, there are 360 degrees in a circle. So what you do is you take 360 degrees, divide it by the number of points in the circle, And that's the number of degrees between each object. Okay? So I want to rotate these 30 degrees. And then I click apply. And there we go. So if you need to make a perfectly evenly spaced circle of things, here is a fantastic way to do that. All right? And we'll probably come back to this when it more directly applies to specific projects. But I did want to show you that that is how you would make a circular series of identical duplications. Okay. So now that I've gone on that tangent, let's get back to our Greek temple. I've got my column on the base, and they're all kind of lined up, which is great. Now what I want to do is I want to align my column. I want to be on the top view here, to the corner of my temple. So I've only got the base selected, so I'm going to hit the up arrow. Oops, not the base. I want the column. There we go. Hit the up arrow. Again, you can also just select it in the outliner. And then I'm going to move this. Now, I still have my grid snapping enabled, which is fine with me. And what I want to do is I want to duplicate this across. So I want to move this, let's say if we do every, maybe 1, 2, let's see, if I move it every 2 units, it'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. That sounds good. Okay, so I'll do this in perspective view so you can see this happen. I have my column. I'm going to go to my duplicate special tool settings. And I'm going to make these just copies. That's fine. I don't need them to be instances. I'm not going to modify this column past this. I will, however, reset the settings. We will group it under the same. Actually, we'll put them in a new group. It'll just be easier. And then I want to translate. We want to move it 2 units in the negative x. So I'm going to. By the way, these 3 fields, if you haven't already surmised, it's x, y, and z. Okay, so if I want to translate x, I'll go -2 in the x box. I don't need to move it in those directions. And then I want 5 copies, and I will click duplicate special, and there we go. Now I have 5 columns. I can now, okay, you can see in my outliner, it made my 5 columns, and it also put them in a group. I can select my original column, put that in the group as well. Okay. Now, I don't want to duplicate the group because I don't need multiple levels of, columns. I can just keep all of the columns in one group. But now I'm going to select these columns, and I'm going to jump back to my top view, and I'm going to do a little bit of counting here. This might be tough to see on the video. Let's go to 5. Okay. So I want to push these, kind of have them run the length of my temple. So if I move it, again, 2 units, we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, so I want 9 copies. So with them all selected, I'm going to go to Edit, Duplicate Special. I'm going to set my Translate X to 0 and my Translate Z to -2. And I want 9 copies. Click Duplicate Special, and there we go. Okay. So we come look at it in this view, and now I have just a field of columns. And I get the camera in there, and whoops, there we go. Now we can see. Cool. But I don't need this many columns. There's actually a big chunk in the middle that I don't need because I need room for the interior chamber. So I'm going to turn off my base here for a second, jump in the top view, and I'm just going to click and drag and select all of the columns that I don't need. So kind of basically blocking out a space for the room, and I will delete them. Okay, so now I've got a space for a room, and I've got my base, and that's looking better. Columns, we've got our base. Let's add this interior room, and I'm going to again start with a cube, and I'm going to name it, and I will name it temple_room. Okay, so this, I'm not going to be very specific with my dimensions, and I'm going to try not to let that bother me. But for this, I'm just going to bring up my, first I'll move it up a little bit. Oh, I got snapping on. We don't need that on. I'm going to turn off my column. No, I'm not. I'm just going to move it up, and then I'm going to start scaling. And I'm just going to get it close. Okay. I can look at it this in the top view is probably an easier way to scale it initially. Okay, we'll scale it out to about there. And we'll scale it back to about there. That looks good. In the top view, let's look at it in the front view. In the front view, this needs to come up. And then instead of scaling this up, if I scaled it up, then I would scale it and then I'd have to move it. Instead, I'm just going to jump into face mode, select that top face, and just move the top face up, which effectively scales it up. Yeah, slightly different, but has the same general effect. All right, at this point, I want this top face to be lined up with the top of the columns because that's what the roof is going to sit on, and it makes sense that that would line up. I don't know if that actually lines up in how Greek temples are made. I am not an archaeologist, nor have I played the God of War games recently, so I'm just going to guess. But I will turn on point snapping once again. You can see again how this is a useful tool, and I will hover my mouse over a top vertex. Things will line up nicely. I can double check this in, for instance, side view, and go to wireframe and zoom in here. You can see that it's lined up perfectly. Okay, so we've got a room. Now the bottom face, we need to make sure that this room is sitting on the floor. So I will select that bottom face and do the same thing. I will snap it to a bottom vertex here and check it in the side view. Go to wireframe. Okay, that is sitting on the floor. Fantastic. All right, so I have a room, but I don't have a way to get into the room. So I'm going to go to edge mode, and I'm going to add a couple of edge loops. So shift right click, insert edge loop tool. I'm going to check my settings. Multiple edge loops, I will use that, and 2 is plenty. Again, this is staying nice and simple. And then I need to add one more edge loop, so I'm going to change that to relative distance. I'm going to turn off my columns. And I'm just going to set this edge loop is going to define the door height. So right about there is fine with me. Now I need to make the doorway. So I'm going to select that face, that would be the door. And I'm going to hit delete. I'm also going to delete the inside floor of this room because I've already got the temple base. I don't need two faces on top of each other. All right, so now I have an entryway into this room. The last thing that I'm going to do is just give that doorway a little bit of depth. So I'm going to select just these 3 edges and then shift right click and extrude them. Hit W to move and turn off snapping. There we go. And then just move them back just a little bit. Okay, and then I will extrude this one more time. I'll do this in wireframe so you can see what's happening. I'm going to, again, with those selected, shift right click, extrude the edge. This time I'm just going to scale them out And then I will select this top edge and just move it. Oops. I need to have the whole edge selected. I know I've got the edge there. Come on. This is the edge that I want. Let me select that edge. Please. Alright. I guess not. Alright, instead I'll just move those. Oh. I don't know. See, this is the edge that I wanted. Move that up, and then I will move this back down into place. There. More or less. Okay. Alright, so I've got a room, and then I just gave that a little bit of thickness. So that'll be it for the center room. I'll turn the columns back on. I'm going to just put that room on its own layer. I don't always give everything its own layer. That's a bit unnecessary, but it works for this. Okay, so I've got a temple, I've got some columns, and I actually think that these columns are too much, so I'm going to select the base, hit the up arrow to select the whole column group, and delete them. Okay, it just felt a little cluttered. Alright, the last thing that I'm going to do is add a triangular top to the temple. It's going to work in much the same way. However, I'm not going to start with a pyramid. I am going to start with a cube. Cubes and planes, actually, are probably the two most common primitives that I use. So I'm going to add it. I'm going to call this temple roof. Okay, and now I'm going to scale it. Like so, and like so. And again like so. Okay. Now I'm going to go into face mode. And we can move this face up. So I wanted to find the total height of the roof. I'll select this bottom face, turn on my point snapping, and position it accordingly. I think I may be slightly off there. We'll go into front view to confirm. Nope, we're good. Okay. All right. So I don't want to make the whole thing just a sharp pyramid. I actually want a little bit of thickness before it starts to taper. So I'm going to add an edge loop right about here. Yeah, that'll work. And now I can select these two outside edges, and to keep them even, I will just select them both and scale them in. Now, you could make this triangular shape by turning off snapping first, moving one edge in and then moving the other edge in and trying to approximate and hope that you get them pretty close. But it's a whole lot easier if you want to keep things even, is to select both edges and instead of moving, scale them in towards each other. And that will keep things nice and even. Okay? We can also see at this point that this needs to come forward a little bit more. Get some of that overhang going on. Same thing here. Okay. Now we can start adding some embellishment. You know, the temple for our purposes is more or less done, but it's a whole lot more interesting if we add some embellishment. So I'll jump back to edge mode. I'm going to add a couple of edge loops. We'll do multiple edge loops. I'm going to add them right here. And then I'm going to select this face loop. Remember, you can select one face, hold down Shift, double click on the next face, and you will select that whole loop. And now I will Shift right click and extrude the face. And the thickness, I will hold down Control, middle click and drag, and extrude that in. So we got a nice little bit of detail there. And then I'm going to do the same thing with this front face here. Shift right click, extrude the face. And this time I don't want a thickness, I want the offset. So I'm going to highlight the offset, middle click and drag, hold down Control, move that in a little bit. Okay. Then I will hit G to repeat that last command. So repeat the extrude. And then this time I will just do the thickness, hold down Control, and give a nice little indentation there. Okay. So, oops, go back to object mode here. I'm going to select all of my columns and hit 3 to smooth them out. So there is a very simple Greek temple. Relied a lot on snapping, just kind of as far as positioning things. Excuse me. That's the thing about Greek temples, is they tend to be very symmetrical and specifically placed. So this is why snapping is so useful when making them. Now, you could certainly take this a lot further. You could embellish the details in the columns. You know, a lot of Greek temples. Let's see if I can find a good example here. Okay, they've got this repeating kind of pattern here on the inlay, so you could make a separate object, inlay it, and then duplicate it around. You know, add more steps. These columns were typically made actually in sections, so you could do that. You could add tapers to the columns. There's a ton of additional detail that you could do. You could even go so far as to make this really ornate column top there. But the same principles apply. So hopefully you learn something and you have your own Greek temple with which you can do as you like.